Hi, everybody. Thanks for watching this and listening. What I want to talk about today is the question addressed here in the title of the talk, which is, are we seeing something that we could call the end of neoliberal globalism? Now, of course, this is not the first time the question has been asked. In fact, both of these things, neoliberalism and globalism, have been pronounced dead many previous times in the past. In 2016, there were obituaries for neoliberalism after the successful vote for Brexit and the victory of Trump in November 2016. But there, I think already appearances could be deceptive. The Brexit campaign, as we probably know by now, was always about pivoting from a European market to a more global one, and was never actually about a desire to turn inward and forget the world. The vision was of trying to recreate a kind of a Singapore on Thames. This was always much closer to the truth than anything else. The Trump administration, for all of its bellicose rhetoric, was mostly interested in a Reagan-style move of aggressive trade measures against an East Asian competitor. This time it was China. For Reagan, it was Japan. And in both cases, the goal was really less to kind of break with the world market and rather to simply gain better access for American products inside of an East Asian consumer space. In the Trump years, there was no industrial policy. The idea of a coming infrastructure week was actually a kind of a running joke amongst the White House press corps. The Midwesterners who had been left behind by globalization waited in vain for some kind of a return of manufacturing jobs that they were promised in the course of the Bannon-conducted Trump campaign. When it came to finance, the continuity was even more stark. If anything, Wall Street was given even more leash to run with the tax cut that was the really only major legislative achievement of the Trump 4 years in office. The cabinet that he put together included many people from Wall Street, including people like Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin, and the longtime Rothschild banker and so-called, quote, king of bankruptcy, Wilbur Ross, who was his commerce secretary. With the rise of the far right in Central Europe, one could see something similar. The AfD party in Germany is rightfully condemned for its Islamophobia and its anti-migrant sentiment, but it's no enemy of capitalism, or indeed of a certain form of neoliberalism. What the AfD called for and still calls for is even stricter austerity measures and a return to national control of the money in order to keep German exports competitive. There's a similar story in Switzerland and Austria, where the far right was united in a belief in what I've called folk capital rather than human capital, measuring populations in terms of their relative productivity and relative intelligence according to a quite merciless market calculus. So in short, as of 1 year ago, you're asking this question, is there an end of neoliberal globalism? It would seem that the most successful contestants to the dominant status quo did not seem to be presenting a kind of foundational challenge to the existing order. The most striking example of a switch from business as usual was certainly Trump's trade war, but even there, it was possible to read his muscular stance vis-a-vis China as something that was drawing from less frequently used, but still legitimate weapons of unilateral trade policy. These are the kind of things that are seen as more or less allowed, putting these large tariffs, as Trump did, on aluminum and steel and other imports, as long as people thought that they were short-term weapons used to get China back to a negotiating table to create something again like the WTO 2.0. So it looked like disruptive times for neoliberal globalism, but not anything like the end times. There was not a kind of apocalyptic air, actually, over the status quo conduct of the global economy. One of the things that I'll argue today, though, is that the last year really has changed everything. I think that we have moved from the demise of neoliberal globalism being one of many scenarios and not the most likely one, to it being perhaps the most likely scenario. And that's not something that I say lightly, considering I have spent a lot of my time in the last few years refuting people every time they say too quickly that neoliberalism is dead, neoliberalism is dead. So what I want to do today is to substantiate this claim I'm making, that neoliberal globalism may now be passing away as a dominant paradigm of global economic governance in rhetoric and perhaps even in practice. But also I want to argue that whatever comes next may not necessarily be better and may actually simply reproduce many of the same inequalities and injustices that neoliberalism has been so rightfully tarred with. So I want to pursue my argument by moving through the past, the present, and the future of economic globalism. For the past mode of globalism, I want to talk about the ideas of Imperium and Dominium, drawing in large part on my book, Globalists. Also the match terms of Cadillacian encasement, as well as Zeno's rights. For the present, I want to talk about the much more well-matched triptych here: China, chips, and carbon. And for the future, I want to talk about territory triage and the Greek concept of the theat. So let's begin with the past. In the book that I published a couple of years ago, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, I gave a kind of a stylized account of the 20th century. Instead of a clash between ideologies of fascism, communism, and liberalism, or a period of 2 world wars followed by a Cold War, I talked about the 20th century as defined by 2 apparently contradictory movements, the negotiation of which constituted really the dilemma of global economic governance. The 2 contradictory movements were this: across the 20th century, we witnessed, on the one hand, ever greater global economic interdependence across all metrics, from volumes of trade to cross-border financial flows to the frequency of the movement of people over borders. The world, as the cliche had it, had become a smaller place through new technologies of transportation and communication. But at the same time, politically speaking, the world was becoming a more fractured place. The number of polities worldwide kept on growing over the course of the 20th century. So we have a basic problem here. There are ever more spaces within which decisions were being made, even as the overall space was itself becoming ever more interconnected. And this is the way that the people at the heart of my book saw the problem of the 20th century. They were interested, and especially in moments where there was a kind of a multiplication of new polities. So when were there kind of bursts of the appearance of new polities? Let's look again at the PowerPoint for that. You can see here that there were basically 3 significant moments in the 20th century when we saw new spikes in the addition to what you could think of as the kind of club of sovereign nation states. The first was after the First World War, with the breakup of the territorial empires of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The second moment came in the 1960s with the end of overseas European empires in Africa and Asia. And the third came after the crack-up of the communist bloc, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union in the 1990s. So these are 3 important moments, which I think we could think of as 3 great secessions, as moments that brought the problem of global economic governance more sharply into focus. So the problem that the actors in my book follow, and I think this is the problem of neoliberal globalism, is the question of how you can balance this world of politics with a world of economics. It was a problem that they had their own categories to describe. So one of the ways that they described the problem was by borrowing categories from Roman law, which were also categories used by Carl Schmitt and also Immanuel Kant. Those are the categories of Imperium and Dominium. The world of Imperium is the world of states and people, the world of sovereignty. The world of Dominium is the world of things, money, goods, property, the world of ownership. The challenge that the intellectuals in my book saw in the 20th century was how to keep these two in balance. How do you prevent people from mistaking sovereignty for ownership? How do you prevent especially these new states from thinking incorrectly that everything inside of their borders somehow belongs to them, the citizens? What institutions can be set up so that nations recognize or are forced to recognize that claims of property also move over borders without feeling that their own sense of sovereignty or autonomy is being infringed on? Because the motor of the multiplication of polities in the 20th century was the principle of mass democracy, one person, one vote, transposed to the global level of formal equality between horizontally arranged nation states, then this was the kind of riddle of globalism. How to reproduce the international division of labor, the degree of the free movement of goods and capital over borders, and the security for investment overseas that had characterized much of the world in the 19th century, resting on a principle of empire and a principle of difference. How to recreate that, what had been an openly hierarchical division of populations into different groups based on civilization, skin color, and gender. How to recreate that same security for capital globally in an era when the consensus now was not about difference and hierarchy, but at least formally, politically speaking, around the principle of equality. Now we have the idea that it's no longer acceptable to say that some populations are unable to govern themselves or should be kept out of the family of nations. The reigning ideology by the end of the 20th century is that everyone should get their own state, everyone should get their own nation, and these should all, at least formally speaking, there's all kinds of ways in which this isn't true in practice, of course, but formally speaking, there's a kind of shared space at the table of global governance. So one of the ways that one of the intellectuals that I write about, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian political philosopher and economist, thought about this problem of recreating global economic security in an era of the nation state was by using this Greek notion of the xenos, or the guest friend. Rules are required, he wrote, which make it possible at each moment to ascertain the boundary of the protected domain of each, and to distinguish between the meum, that which is mine, and the tuum, that which is yours. This category of what I call xenos rights helps us to think about individuals having protected rights to safe passage and unmolested ownership of property and capital, regardless of what territory they live in. This is supposed to be a right, a xenos right, that is not applicable only within the unitary space of dominium, but rather exists also in the fragmentary space of imperium. So this is one of the first things to understand about neoliberal globalism, is there's less of an interest in a way for the rights of citizens within borders, and more of an interest in the rights of this xenos, this person who travels beyond their borders, to be able to carry their goods, their money with them, and to be able to make claims on property in states that are not their own. So this is the conundrum, right? How can you protect xenos rights? Not so much the citizens' rights, but the rights of the foreigner when they when they're an economic actor abroad. They were very well aware that this was a right that required the political institutions of Imperium to ensure it. So what they saw as economic freedom or economic rights couldn't exist only in the space of the market or only in the space of the economy. It couldn't exist actually in the absence of states. It needed those states to protect it. And as the scholar Katerina Pistor would put it, they also needed the law to encode it, right? So assets required states to exist. Wealth requires states to exist. Neoliberals were well aware of this. One of the kind of misconceptions of neoliberal philosophy is that it's the desire to somehow do away with the state, but that's simply not true. Neoliberals were dependent on the state. They understood that economic freedom and economic rights required states, required laws to exist. And in fact, part of the argument I make in the book is that neoliberal philosophy is actually not so much a philosophy of economics or markets, but it is a philosophy of law and of statecraft. It's a way of designing governments in a way that prioritize certain freedoms over others. So the 20th century in my book, the telling of my book, is a kind of a long search for what we call the guardians for the world economic constitution, or the Wirtschaftsverfassung, as the neoliberals would describe it in the German term. That doesn't so much mean just a written constitution in the American sense, but it also means sort of an organic relationship that exists between the political and the economic that needs to be safeguarded and maintained. So in other words, there's a kind of a doubled world that neoliberals saw emerging in the modern period. On the one hand, a world of the interconnected world economy. On the other hand, a fragmented world of nation states. And the task of globalism is coming up with a regulatory framework within which to preserve economic rights and freedoms despite the facts of political multiplication. So it was always implied that nation states would never sort of be fully autonomous or fully self-determining. They always would be nested somehow within another superstructure, another set of supranational institutions designed to protect this boundary between what is mine and what is yours. That's the primary border in the world. What is mine and what is yours? The problem here, of course, was that this very world, this world of ownership and exchange, commerce, property, was, if allowed to run its natural course, extremely complicated. Right? It produced, in fact, a set of relationships that the neoliberals themselves conceded were so complex they couldn't actually be understood. The unknowability of the economy is another core principle of neoliberal philosophy. One of their common reference points is the writings of St. Augustine, who describes the naivety of a person, a regular human, who looks at a mosaic, looks at only one part of a mosaic, and assumes that it's disorderly and ugly because he or she lacks the ability to see the complete picture, the way that divine sight allows God to see the whole picture, in which the mosaic is revealed as a larger order. So this is the neoliberal perspective on the world economy, which is consistent with that of kind of the Scottish Enlightenment and people like Adam Smith, is that humans have a constrained understanding of their own circumstances. Therefore, it's hard for them to see that the larger order of business and commerce actually produces a greater unity. Hayek's word for this greater unity, or this process of harmonious interaction, was the catalaxy. This was the term that he took from Greek to describe the world of order creating in exchange. So the economy for neoliberals, and I think this is also important, is not just something that can be sort of tabulated in lists. It's not just a world of statistics. It's not even the world of the fall and rise of stock prices on the DAX or the Dow Jones. In fact, Hayek, who probably went furthest with this, compared the world of market exchange to other systems of living and non-living entities, from the neurons of the brain all the way up to the stars of the galaxy, with humans as a kind of intermediate layer. So one of the core principles of neoliberal globalism is this strong sort of doctrine of what you could call the unknowable economy, or what I talk about in the book as the sublime world economy. One of the things that mobilized the neoliberals into action in the 1930s, in fact, was the attempt of social democrats, socialists, to try to model the economy, to try to plan the economy by creating some version of oversight, being able to measure national income, being able to measure GDP, which became a new thing only in the 1930s. This attempt to kind of pin down and understand the economy as a quantifiable place was actually rejected strongly by neoliberals in the 1930s. They felt instead the only way you could approach the economy was to sort of respect its mystical qualities, respect its unknowability, and then create a legal framework around it, which will allow it to act with, maximum freedoms in certain directions. This is why in my book, I talk about not the liberation of markets, because I think that's a false metaphor or a misleading metaphor, but the encasement of markets, because it's about creating laws that lead towards certain outcomes and prevent other outcomes, not a sort of open space of freedom. It's actually a way of containing human behavior and human activity in quite specific ways. So these institutions that emerge across the span of the 20th century are not always ones that could be described as neoliberal. There are many things around, let's say, labor law, or attempts to regulate carbon emissions that don't fall in line with neoliberal thinking. But there are many that do work better with the neoliberal globalist framework. So for example, international investment law, which allows for corporations to take countries to court for lost profits. This had its germination in the thinking of neoliberal economists in the 1950s, and has now been turned into a system of investment treaties, also known as bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, that number in the tens of thousands. So this is a very, very elegant example of the attempt to protect xenos rights through a legal mechanism, even beyond the state's, the capital owners' own membership. So this sort of globalization of capital rights is something that has been carried out in many ways that I have written about, but don't necessarily have time to go into here. In the telling of the neoliberals, there were several false starts. So the League of Nations, they thought might be kind of promising in the 1920s, because it also believed in, open door trade, and was opposed explicitly to things that they called economic nationalism. That term was coined in the 1920s and 30s to describe their enemy and what they were opposed to. But the United States never signed on to the League of Nations. It remained quite weak in terms of enforcement. A second thing that became quite interesting was the United Nations, but very quickly it became clear that political interests would override economic interests, in the sense that this principle of imperium or sovereignty was always also going to be more important than the principle of ownership or kind of global xenos rights, especially because the rising number of states from the poorer world, the world of Asia, Latin America, and Africa in the 1950s and 60s meant there was, proportionally speaking, more people with votes in the General Assembly to push for things like redistribution, colonial reparations, increased foreign aid, commodity power, the kind of stuff that the new international economic order in the 1970s is most well known for. So the UN, also not really much of a contender. One thing that did become interesting for the neoliberals in the 1950s and 60s was the emerging European economic community. And for a very specific reason. Neoliberal intellectuals were very skeptical in general about the EEC because they felt, especially with agriculture, that it was just creating this big protectionist blob in the middle of Europe with the original 5 signatory countries, original 6 signatory countries. But the thing they did like about it was the enshrinement of competition policy into the EEC, especially in the early 1960s, which jurists like Ernst Joachim Messmaker, a German neoliberal who is still around, still alive, he realized right off the bat that this was actually very interesting, that the European Court of Justice was being given special authority so that it could actually reach into sovereignty. It could reach into the space of imperium and make national governments open up their markets, make national governments stop subsidizing their own manufacturers, make national governments ultimately sell off state-owned industry and state-owned businesses. So the ECJ and European competition law, and this is something that other, of course, sociologists have written about, people like Hübner and Armin Schäfer. The competition policy of the European Economic Community became something that looked very promising as a sort of a model for top-down supranational intervention. But over the course of the 20th century, the thing that sort of, in a way, encapsulates most cleanly the vision for a kind of neoliberal globalism was the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. Why were the neoliberals so excited about this? Mostly because it fulfilled the 2 principles for the rule of law at the world level that Hayek would have described. One, it had the principle of isonomy, meaning one law for the world that was applicable globally. Developing countries, poorer countries were given concessions and were not forced to follow the same disciplines as richer countries at first, but the idea was that would eventually fall away. So you have the isonomy, or your one law for the world economy. And then you also had enforceability. So the GATT, which is what preceded the WTO, didn't actually have enforcement mechanisms. So countries, if they wanted to, could just reject the judgment of the GATT. You couldn't do that with the WTO. The WTO had the ability to allow other states to put trade measures on you if the appellate body at the WTO had decided that that was justifiable. So there was a way to kind of hit back at countries for breaking the laws of the WTO. And the WTO in practice, of course, ended up being anything but this kind of perfect, beautiful guardian of the global neoliberal economy. And there was enormous amounts of literature on the way that the WTO, acted in ways it wasn't always expected to act, and didn't only favor American interests, for example, and it's a complex story that it can't really be pared down. But the point is that in the kind of neoliberals' own telling, in their own telling, the WTO became a kind of beautiful guardian for the world economy that could ensure that capital rights could become something like human rights. And the vision was that you would be able to, go around your own national government if necessary and make appeals straight to the WTO. And that could be a way for there to be a kind of a disciplining of national sovereignty over time. Of course, as we know already, in 1999, there was a huge protest against the ministerial meeting of the WTO in Seattle. And in fact, they haven't been able to close a negotiating round since. And for a bunch of reasons, some of which I'm about to get into, the kind of dream of neoliberal globalism to others, to some people, already seemed like it was suffering very early. I mean, already in the late 1990s, people were saying that the dream of neoliberalism was beginning to unwind. So how did they make that argument? Let's look at the next set of talking points that I want to hit here. So the 1990s are obviously an interesting moment because you have a new set of state actors entering the world economy as new nations, no longer part of the USSR, no longer part of Yugoslavia, for example. And what ends up transpiring? Now, this is skipping some years, but taking us to the present, I think we can think of three challenges to neoliberal globalism through the categories of China, chips, and carbon. So to begin with, China, since people started pronouncing neoliberalism dead in the late 1990s, anyway, the question was always, what will the United States do, right? I mean, when you say, is neoliberalism alive or dead, partially what you're saying is, does the United States still follow the principles at any level of neoliberal globalism? Something very extraordinary, of course, has happened in the last 20 years, which is that China has embarked on one of the most extraordinarily accelerated rates of industrialization and expansion of economic infrastructure and economic capacity of any power at any time in world history, right? So in the last 20 years, we've lived through something that has never happened before, which is, the volume of movement of people from countries into cities, the increase of per capita income, the takeover of sort of sector after sector of world economic activity by Chinese producers has really changed the whole calculus for the remaining economic players in the world economy. China enters the WTO in 2001. The United States thinks that this is just going to be a payday for American businesses. They will get a bunch of new consumers, and they'll be able to take advantage of extending their own production chains. So to begin to use the cheap wage labor of China to produce goods that they will then sell back to the Chinese, as well as back to the Americans. And this is cast as a kind of a win-win situation for Americans. Of course, never really discussed in that was the fate of people whose jobs would be rendered obsolete by new forms of globalization, meaning their jobs would be outsourced to China in the way that it was often discussed and thought about. There's ways that this is an inaccurate depiction of what happened because of the fact that innovation in processes and production processes and automation have been equally important in reducing the number of people that you need to run things like factories. But nevertheless, it's clear that in the early 2000s, American policymakers were thinking about people mostly as consumers and only second as workers. And the idea was what you made up for in your consumer life, the cheap goods that you'd be able to consume would more than compensate for whatever disruption of your working life you had actually experienced. So that was the kind of, the rise of China has sort of led the United States to begin reconceiving of globalization as something that is no longer something that is perfectly natural and the most powerful actor should win. Rather now, the United States sees China as a kind of a zero-sum competitor. And if China wins, then that means that the United States is losing. And that is a state of affairs that the United States wants to counteract. Now, the last year, since the outbreak of the COVID crisis, has really sort of given more strength to the argument that the United States needs to, quote unquote, bring supply chains home. The idea now, even under the new Biden administration, is that nations need to have their own capacity for not just things like personal protective equipment or pharmaceuticals, but also things like batteries and essential materials. So when Biden came in, one of the first things he did was he launched a 100-day review of supply chains and supply chain resilience, as it's called. And the focus there was pharmaceuticals. It was on lithium and other necessary materials for green technologies and electric vehicles. And it was also on chips or superconductors, meaning the hardware that is necessary for the ever more digitized way of life that we're all living. So now what we have all of a sudden in 2021 is the EU, India, China, and the United States are all trying to arrive at some kind of self-sufficiency around at least one super essential input into the economic productive chain, which is the chip or the semiconductor. And this is something that really runs against the whole trend of globalization and indeed of neoliberal globalism for the last 25 years, right? The idea that a nation should have to build something itself on its own territory rather than simply trusting that Zeno's rights would be taken care of and allowing for that production to happen elsewhere. The principle of the last 25 years has absolutely been that you follow the lowest wages to where they are, then you build the manufacturing capacity there. And if you have troubles over there, then you have investment treaties, you have WTO, you have NAFTA, you have other sort of regional treaties that can be called on to enforce your rights to your property abroad. Well, that's simply not the way it is at the moment, right? We have a move towards a vision of re-territorialization, of bringing back manufacturing capacities, which is very significant. I mean, the naturalization of globalism, the idea that it's not possible to stand in the way of ever more economic interdependence, the idea that globalization is something like the passing of the seasons or the changing of the tides, or a storm, as Gerhard Schroeder put it, that people can only react to, states can only react to. The language is very different now. And that in itself, at the kind of rhetorical or discursive level, marks a big shift. The denaturalization of globalism means that these new languages of territory and supply chain resilience and so on are now viable in ways that they haven't been for the last several decades. The third point on my list there is the question of carbon. Although, of course, the fact of global warming is planetary by definition, the fact is that by actually taking seriously climate disaster and climate catastrophe, you don't necessarily lead to a more economically and internationally cooperative outcome, right? It's very possible that taking climate seriously leads to further entrenchment behind national borders, a prioritization of national needs over others, and the need to kind of secure chains of manufacturing that would actually withdraw investment globally to increase national capacity for producing the tools and the resources necessary for transition. So you can think here, for example, of the attempt to create an all-European supply chain for batteries, the efforts to exploit rare earth minerals in places like the US here, where they had previously would have simply gone elsewhere in search of labor costs. So you can see how the global problem of climate change can actually have fracturing effects on the project of neoliberal globalism, insofar as neoliberal globalism assumes the free movement of goods and capital over borders. So the shock of the pandemic, the challenge of China, the possibility of endless money creation, which is something that I don't even have time to get into here, but the success of the last 12 years of quantitative easing, success in the sense that it didn't end up producing a kind of expected inflation. In fact, there's difficulty producing inflation. Means that a lot of the the assumptions about austerity and fiscal discipline don't seem to hold. At least they're not holding in the minds of many policymakers at the moment. The loss of legitimacy of institutions like the WTO, the apparent existential threat of something like climate change, registering with middle class mainstream voters. Witness the popularity of the Green Party right now in Germany ahead of the elections. All of these things could very well signal a transition out of what has been a rather long period of neoliberal globalism. So let's say that this is right. Let's say that for the time being, neoliberal globalism is not the primary show in town. What does that actually leave us with? Well, that brings us to our last set of points here, the question of the future of economic globalism. So I set this up here around 3 big points: territory, triage, and theat. In terms of territory, we can see some of these future dynamics already at play, right, in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Much of the discourse was around this kind of Olympics of state capacity, with the number of cases was mapped out, right, over a grid over time, and a kind of like a grim horse race, like who has the most deaths, who has the most infections, where are they rising, where are they falling? These were lines that were drawn as nations. But the truth is, as so often, the nation itself doesn't tell the whole story, right? So in the US, India, Italy, elsewhere, there were actually often intense movements towards the decentralization of responses, even within nations. Cities closed themselves off from each other to prevent people from either getting in or out. In the United States, state governors were hiding shipments of masks and gowns to prevent other state governors from expropriating them or intercepting them. The dynamic was even being fed by some policymakers in the United States and the Trump administration, who were sort of playing states off each other. Who can open fastest? Who can return to normal most quickly? Who can kind of reopen for business? There was the creation of languages of green zones and red zones in India and in the United States too. Very interesting categories, which green zone and red zone actually originated inside of containment clinics for Ebola. Then they moved to the decks of cruise ships, where the pandemic sort of had its first incubation in some ways. And then now it's, in the last year, has been scaled up to the size of the nations, with mobility within countries being restricted in ways that were actually unprecedented in the modern era. It's very strange for national states to stop movement within, even inside of themselves. In other words, this reterritorialization might not only mean the kind of re-enthronement of the nation, but could also have further decentralizing effects inside of the nation, leading to accelerated forms of federalism, or perhaps in some cases, as dreamed of by people on the far right and the far left, forms of secession, and actually extracting themselves from the control of the territorial nation state. And here, I think it's worth pointing out another phenomenon of the neoliberal era. It hasn't always just been scaling up. It hasn't just been the creation of supranational institutions. There's also been the proliferation of subnational and extraterritorial zones of all kinds, from free ports to tax havens, to export processing zones, foreign trade zones, special economic zones. It's worth noting that the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak's budget, passed a few months ago, promises not just a rise in corporate tax, which is notable as a kind of a separation from classic neoliberal globalism, but then also something very much from the neoliberal playbook, 90s style free ports, which will free corporations from tax and oversight in a series of sites across the north of England. So in other words, in the short-term response to the pandemic, there was a kind of appearance of the kind of return to the nation. But if you look more closely, there's actually a lot of fracturing even within the nation. We saw, for example, the migration of people to sites of safety, the people who had the means, And then the very quickly sort of economically motivated movement to sites where taxation would be less onerous. So the movement of Tesla from California to Texas has even sort of ratcheted up the competition, meaning that now the neighboring state of Nevada has suggested that companies should be even allowed to create their own laws for municipalities. It's a kind of a return of the company town of the Old West. So if we see the global space shattering, there's no reason to think that in this new era it won't even shatter more. The loss of these mediating structures like the WTO, treaty institutions, does not necessarily aim in the direction of greater equality or social or economic justice. Rather, it can also deepen the power of the wealthy and further distance weaker and poorer countries from the levers of decision-making. And there's a reason why global South countries in the 1990s weren't uniformly opposed to the WTO. They saw it as actually better of two bad options: either be totally exposed to the unilateral power of the US and other big economies, or have at least a kind of a modicum of a forum for holding the powerful at least to their own language or their own principles. So it's quite possible that the end of the norm of fiscal austerity, even if it was rarely practiced in fact, could help accelerate trends towards crony capitalism as state elites and business elites grow ever closer and exchange enormous infrastructure contracts with one another in exchange for political support. Again, these were features that already coexisted with the neoliberal era, but they might actually accelerate as the language of naturalized neoliberalism ebbs. To this point of triage, in the 1990s, feeling very pessimistic about the world that would follow and what was following the bloc competition of the Cold War, the German poet and essayist Hans Magnus Enzensberger wrote about the concept of triage. He wrote, quote, "Universal solutions which will allow us to treat all patients equally are not in store. It is foreseeable to this kind of predicament will become more and more common and ever more thorny in the future. All imaginable options end in the logic of triage, whether we admit it or not. Even the gradualist approach, the setting of priorities, the limiting of responsibilities, however plausible their justification, do not guarantee a way out of the minefield. At best, they count as a stopgap," end quote. So the containment of pandemics is often accompanied by a sort of a system of color coding, not just zones, but also a system of color coding human bodies. Triage tags, as they're called, indicate whether someone is a member of the walking wounded, direly in need of help, as indicated by a red tag, or deceased, as indicated by a black tag. Despite the sort of claim to horizontality that I began the talk by talking about in the 20th century, the modern era has always been accompanied by a vertical hierarchy, according to which some lives are worth more than others. We can see this dynamic very clearly in the resolution of the COVID-19 outbreak. If you think about the way that the access to the vaccine has been sort of unevenly rolled out in this period, or the way that countries like Germany within the EU have stood against the waiving of patent restrictions for the vaccine itself, suggests that even if sort of neoliberal globalism is maybe on the ropes, this idea of some lives being more valuable than others, some lives being worth overriding the prerogatives of capital for and profit for, and others not, is very much something that can still be with us, even without a language of neoliberalism. Consider also the projections of mortality from climate change, which suggests that actually the poorest nations will account for a small amount of future emissions, but will account for most of the excess deaths. So on current trends, the richest countries will actually suffer the fewer excess deaths, if any at all. In other words, this process of reterritorialization can turn climate catastrophe into another form of post-apocalyptic entertainment in which wealthy populations withdraw behind seawalls, literal and otherwise, while the poor world dies. This brings us to the last bullet point on my list, which is this term feat. I take this from the early 1990s novels of the work of Neil Stephenson, who has, I think, been one of the more pessimistic, but also the more clear-eyed speculators about our potential near future. The term feat designates the lowest order of a free man in Athens. And in Stevenson's world, it designates a person without an affiliation, either public or private, so who is neither a citizen nor attached to one of his many franchise states or kind of private service providers. In the future, we can predict an ever tighter bond between a right to protection and membership in a polity, which might be granted not only or even primarily by nation states, but also city-states, private governments, gated communities, private fortresses of all kinds. This unforgiving logic of triage will allocate resources like vaccinations as they are being allocated now, with a sort of hint of pity for those who go without, but very little regret. After all, one needs to protect one's own first. Paying customers go first. In the American science fiction author Octavia Butler's extraordinary novel, The Parable of the Sower, written in the wake of the Los Angeles riots and published in 1993, she depicts a world of near lawlessness where a demagogic president touts exploratory missions to Mars, which children gather around a shared television in the community to watch. The main character's family is considering moving into a franchise town where you give over all of your rights to a private service provider in exchange for food and protection and a job in a plant that is taking the salt out of ocean water. Talking about the possibility, the protagonist says, quote, "Maybe this town, Olivar, is the future, one face of it. Cities controlled by big companies are old hat in science fiction. The company city subgenre always seemed to star a hero who outsmarted, overthrew, or escaped the company. I haven't ever seen one where the hero fought like hell to get taken in and underpaid by the company. But in real life, that's the way it will be. That's the way it is," end quote. I certainly hope, of course, that this isn't the future that will come after neoliberal globalism. But of course, I guess that's exactly what hangs in the balance in the world we're looking at now. All right, thank you very much for listening, and maybe we can connect through some other means in the future.